"Meet John Doe," my daughter-in-law said, "and if you embarrass us again, you're not welcome at the birth." My throat tightened before I could even find a response. The fluorescent light above the exam room buzzed like an accusation. The nurse had just finished wiping gel from my daughter-in-law's belly, the kind that always feels too cold no matter how warm the room is, and the ultrasound wand sat on its tray like a tiny, ordinary thing that suddenly carried the weight of our entire family. On the screen, the baby was still there, blinking into existence in grainy blacks and grays, while my son stood beside the bed with his hand on her shoulder, proud and protective like he was already the hero of the story. I wasn't supposed to be the villain. I had driven them. I had waited in the hallway listening to other women laugh softly with their partners, listening to the squeak of nurses' shoes, watching a man in a baseball cap cradle a folder like it was fragile. When they called us in, I followed because my son asked me to. "I want you there, Mom," he'd said earlier that morning, like it was a gift, like he hadn't spent the last few weeks acting irritated every time I spoke. Now I stood at the foot of the bed with my purse strap wrapped tight around my wrist, feeling strangely exposed, as if my presence was too loud in a room meant for intimacy. The nurse, young, calm, practiced, smiled and asked the easy question people love to ask when a baby becomes real enough to measure. "Have you picked a name?" My daughter-in-law's face brightened like she'd been waiting for her cue. She looked at my son, then at the screen, and she said it with a sweetness that felt sharpened at the edges. John Doe." She said it louder the second time, like she wanted it to land. The nurse froze for half a beat, just long enough for the air to change. Her mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, not quite professionalism. On the other side of the thin wall, someone in the hallway laughed at something unrelated, but it threaded into the moment, like mockery. My son didn't flinch. He didn't correct it. He didn't even glance at me to see how that name hit. And God help me, I did what I always do when I'm shocked. I tried to keep everyone comfortable. "Sweetheart," I said softly, aiming my voice at my daughter-in-law the way you aim a cup toward a trembling hand. "Have you thought about how that might follow him? On paperwork, on applications? People might think it's a placeholder." My daughter-in-law's eyes slid to me without warmth. Her smile stayed, but it didn't reach her cheeks. "It's my grandfather's name," she said. "He died in September. We're honoring him." "I understand," I said, because I did. I had buried people too. I knew what grief does to families, how it makes them cling to symbols like life preservers. I'm only saying, maybe John as a middle name? Or... My son's hand left her shoulder and dropped to his side like a decision. He turned his head toward me with that expression I'd been trying not to notice lately. A tight jaw, eyes already tired of me, as if my concern was a nuisance he'd been tolerating out of duty. "Mom," he said, and the way he said it, flat warning, made the nurse look down at her clipboard. "Stop." The room went very quiet. Even the hum of the light seemed to sharpen. I blinked once. "I'm not trying to." "You are," my daughter-in-law cut in. "You always do this. You make everything about your anxiety." My son didn't contradict her. He stood there silent, letting her words do what he didn't want to do himself. I felt my face heat, that old humiliating burn that starts at the ears and crawls down the neck. I could hear my own breathing, too present in the room. The paper sheet on the exam bed crinkled under my daughter-in-law's shifting weight, and that small sound made me flinch like I'd done something wrong. "I'm just worried about him," I said, and I hated how small it sounded. My daughter-in-law sighed, a tired little performance. "It's not your baby." That sentence hit harder than it should have, because it wasn't just about names. It was about permission, about territory, about who mattered now. My son finally spoke again, but not to protect me. "If you can't be supportive," he said, eyes locked on mine, "then maybe you shouldn't come to these appointments." I stared at him. This was the boy I had carried groceries for in the rain, the boy whose last name, Doe, had been stitched onto his Little League jersey, the boy who used to laugh when teachers called roll and paused like they weren't sure he was real. I had taught him how to deal with it, how to hold his head up, how to make a joke before anyone else could, and now he was choosing to hand that exact weight to his son like it was an heirloom. The nurse cleared her throat softly. "Well," she said, forcing brightness, "he looks healthy. Strong heartbeat." My daughter-in-law stroked her belly, satisfied. My son's posture relaxed, like the conversation was over because he'd ended it. I opened my mouth, then shut it. Words felt dangerous here. My daughter-in-law's voice turned sweet again, the way a blade turns shiny. "We're having a small birth plan," she said, eyes still on me. "Just us. No stress. No commentary." Then she looked at the screen like it was a witness and said the sentence that cracked something inside me. "Meet John Doe, and if you embarrass us again, you're not welcome at the birth." My son didn't protest. He didn't say my name. He didn't soften it. He just let it happen. I felt my fingers go numb around my purse strap. I could have argued. I could have cried. I could have begged him to remember who I'd been to him. Instead, I did something worse for them. I went quiet. I nodded once, slow and controlled, as if I agreed, as if it didn't matter, as if they hadn't just pushed me out of the most sacred room of their lives. My daughter-in-law relaxed immediately, satisfied with her victory. My son exhaled like he'd been waiting for me to stop being difficult. The nurse opened the door and called for the next patient, and the hallway noise rushed in, voices, footsteps, life moving on, while I stood there feeling like I'd been reduced to a problem they'd handled. I walked out behind them, and as the automatic doors of the clinic slid open, the winter air hit my face cold and clean, and I realized I wasn't going to fight them in that parking lot. Not today. But as I watched my son climb into the passenger seat of her car without looking back at me even once, I reached into my purse, felt my phone under my fingertips, and decided I was done being treated like a background character in my own family. The days after the appointment moved with a strange, brittle politeness, like everyone had agreed to tiptoe around something sharp on the floor. My son stopped calling. Not dramatically, no announcement, no argument, but the casual check-ins vanished. No more "did you eat" texts, no quick calls while he drove home from work. When I sent a message asking how the next appointment went, the reply came hours later, 3 words only. "All good, Mom." No punctuation, no warmth. At the grocery store, I caught myself reaching for things I thought he might like. His favorite cereal, the brand of coffee he always teased me for buying, and then putting them back, embarrassed by the reflex. My cart felt too light as I rolled it through the aisles under fluorescent lights that made everyone look slightly unwell. At home, my phone stayed face up on the kitchen table like it was waiting to accuse me of something. It never rang. When the group chat notification finally chimed, it wasn't from him, it was from her. "We've decided to announce the name this weekend," my daughter-in-law wrote. "Please keep opinions to yourself." There it was, clean, public enough to sting. I typed, erased, typed again, settled on, "I understand, wishing you both well." The message showed as read almost immediately. No response. That Saturday, they hosted a small dinner. I debated going. I stood in my bedroom holding a sweater I'd worn too often, the sleeves thinned at the elbows, and wondered if staying home would look like sulking. I chose the sweater anyway. It felt like armor. Their dining room was bright when I arrived, warm light spilling from the windows into the early evening. A few friends were already there, laughing, holding glasses of wine. My son hugged me quickly, a one-arm gesture that ended before it started. My daughter-in-law smiled at me like she was greeting a neighbor she barely remembered. I noticed where they'd placed me, end of the table farthest from her, near the door. The chair wobbled slightly when I sat, one leg shorter than the others. I didn't ask for a different one. Halfway through the meal, someone asked about baby names. The table leaned in collectively, eager. My daughter-in-law set down her fork with ceremony. "We're naming him John Doe," she said. A few people laughed. Someone thought it was a joke. "No, really," she continued, smiling. "John Doe, after my grandfather." The laughter died awkwardly. A woman across from me raised her eyebrows. Another guest cleared his throat and said, "That's memorable." My daughter-in-law squeezed my son's hand. "We love it." I focused on cutting my chicken into smaller pieces than necessary. The knife scraped softly against the plate, a repetitive sound that grounded me. "So cool," someone said finally, too loudly. "Very unique." My son glanced down the table toward me for the first time that evening. His eyes lingered, waiting. I knew what he wanted. Silence. Compliance. Proof that I could behave. I lifted my glass of water and took a sip. The room seemed to release a collective breath. Later, as dessert was served, my daughter-in-law stood to make a small toast. She spoke about legacy, about honoring the past while building the future, about how names carry meaning. Then she looked directly at me. "And we're so grateful for everyone who's been supportive," she said, voice smooth. "It really shows who respects our choices." My son nodded along. It was subtle, polite, perfectly deniable. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, the instinct to apologize for something I hadn't done. Instead, I pressed my feet flat to the floor and stayed quiet. When I went to the bathroom, I caught my reflection in the mirror, lines deeper around my mouth than I remembered, eyes tired but alert. I told myself to breathe, to get through the night. On my way back, I overheard voices in the hallway. "I just don't want negativity around the baby," my daughter-in-law was saying. "Stress is bad for him." "I know," my son replied. "I'll handle it." Handle it. They didn't see me standing there. Or maybe they did and chose not to turn around. I returned to my seat and finished my coffee alone, while the conversation shifted to nursery colors and stroller brands. When I left, my daughter-in-law hugged everyone else warmly. For me, she offered a nod. Outside, the air had cooled. I stood by my car for a moment longer than necessary, keys cold in my palm, feeling like I'd just survived a performance I hadn't auditioned for. The next week brought small exclusions that added up. An ultrasound photo posted online that I hadn't seen before it went public. A shower invitation that arrived late, tucked into my mailbox like an afterthought. When I asked my son about it, he said, "We didn't want to overwhelm you." At the pharmacy, the cashier glanced at my name on the prescription and smiled awkwardly. "Doe," she said. "Like John Doe?" I forced a chuckle. "Something like that." Even strangers seemed in on the joke now. One afternoon, my sister called. She hesitated before speaking, a habit she'd picked up over the years. "I saw the name announcement," she said carefully. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," I said too quickly. She didn't push, but before hanging up, she added, "If you need me, I'm here." It was the first kindness offered without conditions in weeks. That night, my son finally called. His voice was tight. "You hurt her feelings," he said without preamble. "I didn't say anything," I replied. "That's the problem," he snapped. "Your silence is judgment." I closed my eyes, counting my breaths. "I'm trying to respect your choices." "Then do it," he said, "fully, or step back." There it was, the line drawn. After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table long after the food on my plate went cold. The light above me hummed, harsh and unforgiving. I realized they weren't just asking for agreement. They were asking for erasure. And as I stared at my phone, another message lit up the screen. This one from an unfamiliar number, with a single sentence that made my stomach drop. I keep thinking about how a name can become a mirror, reflecting things you never meant to see, and how long it took me to learn that lesson myself. I grew up in a house where work came before words. My father left before sunrise and came back with his hands cracked and red, smelling of metal and oil. My mother folded silence into every corner, as if noise cost money we didn't have. We were taught to endure, to make do, to carry things quietly so they didn't break. I learned early that names were tools. You signed them. You answered to them. You didn't romanticize them. When I was 18, I took my first real job at a small insurance office downtown. The building was old, its windows always coated with a film of dust that turned afternoon light into a dull haze. They handed me a brown cardboard box on my first day. Inside was a stapler, a calculator, a stack of blank forms, and a brass nameplate with my last name engraved on it. D-U-E. No first name, just D-U-E. I set it on my desk and felt something settle in my chest. That nameplate followed me for years, migrating from desk to desk as I moved apartments, the edges slowly dulling where my fingers touched it absent-mindedly while I worked. It became my anchor, proof that I existed in systems that preferred placeholders to people. I married young, not because I was swept away, but because stability looked like a life raft. My husband was kind in the beginning, earnest, with a laugh that filled rooms. We built a life with careful optimism, counting dollars, planning purchases months in advance. When our son was born, I held him under harsh hospital lights and whispered his name over and over, testing how it felt in my mouth, making sure it belonged to him and not to anyone else. Those early years blurred together. Long shifts, second jobs, dinners eaten, standing at the counter. I worked days at the office and nights cleaning classrooms at the community college. The smell of chalk dust clung to my clothes, even after washing. I kept a small leather notebook in my bag, one I used to track hours and expenses, every dollar accounted for. That notebook became another anchor, its pages softening with use, corners bent, ink smudged from nights when my hands shook with exhaustion. I didn't resent the work. I resented the fragility of everything. One missed paycheck could unravel us. One illness could sink us. So I tightened my grip and carried on. When my husband left, quietly with apologies that sounded rehearsed, I didn't fall apart. I reorganized. I sold the dining set we barely used. I took on overtime. I learned how to stretch a roast into 3 meals. The notebook filled faster then, numbers crowding the margins like ants. Raising my son alone sharpened me. I learned to read his moods by the way he set his backpack down. I learned when to push and when to let silence do its work. On his first day of school, he came home confused, asking why the teacher laughed when she read his name aloud. I knelt in front of him, hands on his shoulders, and explained gently. I told him names could be funny to people who didn't understand them. I told him he was real anyway. He nodded, trusting me completely. Years passed. He grew tall. He learned how to deflect jokes with humor. I watched him become someone who wanted to be liked, who learned early that ease smoothed paths. When he left for college, I packed his car with supplies I couldn't afford to replace, the leather notebook tucked into my purse like a talisman. I remember the day he introduced me to her. She was vibrant, confident, her laughter quick. I saw how his posture changed around her, straighter, eager. I liked her. I did. She spoke about her grandfather often, a man she described with reverence, his name lingering in the air whenever she mentioned him. I respected that devotion. Grief, I knew, needed places to land. As they built their life together, I stayed in my lane. I offered help when asked. I kept opinions measured. When they announced the pregnancy, I cried alone in my kitchen, the lights soft and forgiving, imagining tiny socks and late-night feedings. The leather notebook lay open on the table beside me, unused now but impossible to throw away. The brass nameplate sat in a drawer, retired but intact, its weight familiar when I lifted it. The letters cool against my palm. I thought about all the forms I'd filled out over the years, all the times my last name had caused pauses, double takes, jokes. I thought about resilience and how it's often built from small, repeated abrasions no one else sees. I never wanted my grandson to inherit that weight unknowingly. I wanted his name to open doors, not stall conversations. I wanted him to be believed when he introduced himself. Looking back, I see how my caution might have sounded like criticism, how concern can be misheard when it's delivered without ceremony. But at the time, it felt like responsibility. the same instinct that had kept us afloat for decades. The anchors of my life, the nameplate, the notebook, the routines, had taught me that institutions don't bend easily, that systems are indifferent, that children pay the price when adults romanticize symbolism without counting the cost. I didn't share these thoughts aloud. I folded them inward where I'd stored everything else that was inconvenient. I smiled. I nodded. I practiced restraint until it became habit. The night after the dinner, I took the notebook out again and flipped through its pages, numbers fading, handwriting changing over the years. The smell of old paper rose up, grounding me. I traced the last entry I'd made, a college tuition payment, long settled, and closed it carefully. On the shelf above my desk, the brass nameplate caught the lamplight, reflecting it back in a dull glow. For a moment, it felt like a warning and a promise at the same time. I didn't know then how quickly the past would reach forward and tap me on the shoulder, demanding to be acknowledged. The shift didn't arrive with a single blow. It seeped in, thin and persistent, like cold through a window frame you keep meaning to fix. It started with logistics, practical things that were suddenly not my business. The baby shower planning moved forward without me. I found out because my sister forwarded an invitation she'd received weeks earlier. Her text, careful. I assumed you knew. I hadn't. When I asked my son about it, he paused just long enough to make the silence uncomfortable. We didn't think you'd want the stress, he said. You get overwhelmed. I stood at the kitchen sink while he spoke, my phone pressed to my ear, water running even though there were no dishes. The sound filled the space between his words, so I didn't have to respond right away. I can handle a party, I said finally. That's not what she thinks, he replied. There it was again, her perspective, presented as fact, my role reduced to a liability they were managing. At the shower itself, I arrived with a carefully wrapped gift and the uneasy feeling of walking into a room where decisions had already been made about me. The living room was crowded, bright with pastel decorations and voices layered over one another. I hovered near the doorway, searching for a place to set my purse. My daughter-in-law greeted me with a smile that paused a few inches short of warmth. "Oh, you made it," she said, like it had been uncertain. She took the gift from my hands without opening it, setting it aside with the others. I noticed how the pile was arranged. Larger boxes in the center, smaller ones pushed to the edges. Mine went to the edge. As people gathered for games, chairs were rearranged. One chair was left without a clear spot. I took it anyway, positioning myself where I wouldn't block anyone's view. The light above flickered slightly, too bright, too direct. I folded my hands in my lap to keep them still. When it came time to open gifts, my daughter-in-law narrated each one enthusiastically. "This is from Sarah," she said, holding up a soft blanket. "She knows our aesthetic." Laughter followed. Another gift. From Mark and Lisa. Practical. When she reached mine, she hesitated. "And this is from my husband's mom," she said, glancing at me briefly before turning back to the group. She unwrapped it quickly, a small savings bond tucked into a card. I'd chosen it carefully, thinking long-term, thinking about options. "Oh," she said. "Interesting." Someone chuckled. "Very old school." My son laughed too, a short sound like he couldn't help himself. The room moved on. I sat back, cheeks burning, listening to conversations swirl around me as if I were slightly out of focus. Afterward, in the kitchen, I reached for a plate to help clean up. My daughter-in-law gently took it from my hands. "We've got it," she said. "You should rest." I wasn't tired, but I stepped back anyway, standing awkwardly by the counter as she and her friends moved efficiently around me, creating a quiet barrier of bodies that excluded without confrontation. On the drive home, my phone buzzed. A message from my son. "She's sensitive right now. Try not to take things personally." I stared at the screen until the words blurred. Weeks passed. Each interaction carried a similar weight. Small corrections, subtle exclusions, moments where I was reminded again and again that my presence required management. At a family gathering, someone asked about the baby's middle name. Before I could even think, my daughter-in-law answered sharply, "There isn't one. We didn't want compromise." Her eyes flicked to me just for a second. Enough. I felt a tightening in my chest, a breath that wouldn't quite finish. I focused on the tablecloth, tracing the pattern with my finger until the moment passed. Another time, my son stopped by to pick up a box of his old things. He stood in the doorway, scanning the living room like a guest. "You should probably stop telling people your opinions about the name," he said suddenly. "I haven't," I replied. He shrugged. "It's how it feels." That word again. Feelings. Elevated over facts. When I offered to help with childcare once the baby arrived, my daughter-in-law responded through my son. "We're setting boundaries early." Boundaries. The word landed heavy, like a door closing softly but firmly. I started noticing the physical spaces too, how I was given the colder chair near the window when I visited, how conversations shifted when I entered a room, how silence stretched after I spoke, just long enough to make me doubt myself. One afternoon, I dropped off a casserole unannounced, thinking of the days after my own childbirth, when food had felt like salvation. My daughter-in-law answered the door with surprise flickering across her face. "We weren't expecting you," she said. "I'll just leave this," I replied, holding out the dish. She took it, setting it on the counter without comment. "You should call first." "I will," I said. She didn't invite me in. As the door closed, I stood on the porch longer than necessary, the air cool against my skin, listening to the muted sounds of life inside continuing without me. At home, I found myself misplacing things. Keys left in the fridge, the leather notebook tucked into a drawer I didn't remember opening. My hands trembled slightly when I poured coffee, the liquid sloshing dangerously close to the rim. There was one evening, late, when my son called unexpectedly. His voice was tight. "She's upset," he said. "About what?" I asked. "You," he replied. "You make everything harder." Something inside me paused, like a held breath that didn't know whether to come out or stay trapped. "I'm trying to stay out of the way," I said quietly. "Well, try harder," he snapped, then immediately softened. "Look, she's pregnant. This isn't about you." The call ended shortly after. I sat in the dark, the only light the glow from the street lamp outside casting long shadows across the floor. My chest felt hollow, like something essential had been scooped out. The lowest moment came without warning. I received a message from a friend congratulating me on becoming a grandmother soon. Attached was a screenshot from a social media post I hadn't seen. My daughter-in-law had written about protecting our peace and keeping negative energy away from our child. The post didn't name me. It didn't have to. The comments were full of support. "Good for you." Family boundaries are so important. You don't owe anyone access. I stared at the screen, my reflection faintly visible in the glass, eyes wide and unblinking. My phone slipped from my fingers onto the couch. I didn't pick it up right away. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. I sat there, hands pressed flat against my thighs, breath shallow. For a moment, I had the urge to stand, to pace, to do something, anything, to shake off the weight. Instead, I stayed still, frozen, as if movement might make it real. Eventually, I stood and walked to the shelf where the brass nameplate rested. I picked it up, the cool metal grounding me. Doughy. The letters were worn, familiar. I thought about how many times I'd been mistaken for a placeholder, how often I'd proven I was real anyway. My phone buzzed again. This time, it was my son. "We need space," he wrote, "for the baby." I lowered myself into a chair, the one with the shorter leg, and sat there as the imbalance pressed into my spine. The message didn't ask, it declared. And as I stared at the name on the metal plate in my hands, I felt something in me finally give way, not into tears, not into rage, but into a quiet, devastating understanding that I had been pushed to the edge of my own family, and no one was coming to pull me back. The moment didn't arrive with shouting or drama. It came on an ordinary Tuesday, wrapped in something so mundane it almost slipped past me. I was at the bank, standing in line beneath harsh overhead lights that flattened everyone's faces into pale reflections. The smell of disinfectant hung in the air. My purse felt heavier than usual on my shoulder, the leather strap digging into my collarbone. I had come to deposit a check from a small freelance job, extra money I'd taken on to keep myself busy, to feel useful. When it was my turn, the teller smiled automatically and asked for my ID. I slid it across the counter, then the check. She typed for a moment, then paused. Her smile faltered, just slightly. "I'm sorry," she said. "This account, it looks like you're no longer listed as an authorized user." I blinked. That can't be right. She turned the screen a fraction toward me. My name wasn't there, just my son's. A newer address. Updated information I hadn't seen. "I've had access to that account for years," I said, keeping my voice steady. "It's where my savings go." The teller hesitated, fingers hovering over the keyboard. "It shows the change was made last week." Last week, I pictured the calendar in my kitchen, the days marked with nothing but quiet meals and unanswered messages. "Who authorized it?" I asked. She shook her head gently. "I can't tell you that." I nodded like I understood, though my ears rang. The line behind me shifted, impatience humming. I gathered my things and stepped aside, heart pounding in a way that felt oddly distant, like it was happening to someone else. Outside, the sunlight was too bright. I sat in my car without starting the engine, hands resting on the steering wheel, feeling the faint tremor in my fingers. The world moved on around me, cars passing, a woman laughing into her phone, a man loading groceries, while something essential recalibrated inside my chest. They hadn't just asked for space. They had quietly cut a cord. I drove home slowly. Inside, the house felt larger than usual, rooms echoing faintly with my footsteps. I set my purse down and stood there, staring at nothing. Then I opened the drawer. The leather notebook lay where it always had, its spine cracked, pages yellowed. I pulled it out and sat at the table, flipping through entries I hadn't needed to consult in years. Dates, amounts, transfers, notes to myself written in tired shorthand. I saw it clearly then. The pattern I'd ignored, the times I'd moved money temporarily, the shared accounts I'd kept open out of trust, the way I'd never insisted on clarity because I didn't want conflict. My phone buzzed. A message from my son. "Just a heads up. We reorganized some finances to simplify things before the baby arrives. Nothing for you to worry about." Simplify. I placed the phone face down on the table. The overhead light flickered once, then steadied. My breath slowed, something clicking into place. This wasn't about sensitivity, or stress, or names. This was control, exercised quietly, dressed up as care. I stood and walked to the shelf, taking down the brass nameplate. Its weight was familiar, grounding. Du. For years, I'd accepted being treated like a placeholder, someone whose presence could be swapped out when inconvenient. Not anymore. I didn't cry. I didn't pace. I didn't call anyone. I made tea and sat at the table, the steam rising gently, my hands steady around the mug. I pulled my laptop closer and logged into accounts I hadn't reviewed in too long. Retirement funds, old emails, statements archived and forgotten. There were discrepancies I hadn't noticed before, small transfers, shared expenses logged under vague descriptions. Nothing dramatic on its own. Together, they told a story I'd been too tired or too trusting to read. Another message came in, this one from my daughter-in-law. "We're doing what's best for our family. Please respect that." I read it once, then again. For the first time, I didn't rush to soften myself around their words. I replied simply, "I need copies of all financial changes made in my name." The typing bubbles appeared, disappeared, reappeared. No answer. The silence that followed felt different from the ones before. It didn't suffocate. It clarified. I opened a new folder on my desktop and labeled it with the date. Inside, I began saving files, screenshots, statements, notes. I scanned pages from the leather notebook, careful and methodical. As I worked, I noticed how calm I felt, how the tremor in my hands had stopped. The house was quiet, but it wasn't empty. It felt aligned. Later that evening, my son called. His voice was sharper than usual. "Why are you asking for documents?" he demanded. "I'm organizing my records," I said. "There's no need," he snapped. "You're overreacting." I looked at the nameplate on the table, its letters catching the light. "I'm reacting appropriately." A pause. Then colder, "You're making this adversarial." "No," I replied. "I'm making it clear." He scoffed. "This is exactly why we needed boundaries." I didn't argue. "Send me the records," I said again. He hung up. I sat back, heart steady, mind clear. The urge to fix, to soothe, to apologize. It was still there, faint but insistent. I let it pass. This wasn't a snap fueled by anger. It was something quieter, more dangerous. It was recognition. I wasn't fighting for inclusion anymore. I was protecting myself. As night settled, I placed the leather notebook beside the laptop, the brass nameplate just beyond it. 3 anchors, 3 truths. I felt the shape of what needed to happen forming, not rushed, not emotional, but inevitable. My phone lit up once more, a new email notification sliding onto the screen. Sender unknown. Subject line short and unsettling enough to make my breath hitch just once before steadying again. I didn't open the email right away. I let it sit on the screen while I rinsed my mug and dried it carefully, the small ritual grounding me. The house was quiet in a way that felt earned now, not imposed. When I finally sat back down, I clicked. It wasn't anonymous after all. It was from my bank's regional office. A compliance notice, dry language, neutral tone. The kind of message that pretends not to carry consequences while outlining them clearly. They were conducting a routine review, it said, triggered by a recent change in account authority involving a senior account holder. Senior. The word landed with a dull thud. They requested documentation to confirm consent. I read it twice, then saved it to the new folder without reacting outwardly. I didn't need adrenaline. I needed order. The next morning, I made a list. Not on my phone, on paper. The leather notebook opened to a blank page, its spine protesting softly. I wrote dates, names, institutions. I didn't write feelings. I started with what I could access easily, old bank statements downloaded and printed. I highlighted patterns, not accusations, transfers that coincided with my son's wedding expenses, withdrawals labeled household adjustment. I remembered those conversations now, how he'd said it was temporary, how I'd nodded because I trusted him. I logged into my retirement account and found beneficiary changes I didn't remember approving. My name still there, but shifted, reduced percentages, adjusted timelines. I took screenshots. I labeled them with dates. I didn't assume intent. I let the facts speak. When I reached a dead end online, I went in person. The bank manager recognized me. He'd approved my mortgage refinance years ago. He smiled, polite but cautious, and asked how he could help. "I need a copy of any authorization forms submitted in my name in the last 3 months," I said. He hesitated. "That may take some time." "That's fine," I replied. He glanced at the compliance notice on my phone when I showed it to him. His posture shifted slightly. "We'll expedite." I sat in the lobby while they worked. The chairs were uncomfortable, the kind designed to discourage lingering. I didn't rush them. I watched people come and go, their problems contained within envelopes and briefcases. When he returned, he placed a folder on the table between us. "Some of these were signed digitally," he said carefully. "I'd like copies of the metadata," I replied. His eyebrows lifted. "Just a fraction. We can provide that." By the time I left, the folder was thicker than I expected. I drove straight to the print shop and made duplicates. One set went into a manila envelope labeled with the date. Another into a binder I'd pulled from the hall closet, the one I used to keep tax records. I added tabs. I didn't label them emotionally, just categories. I called my sister that evening. I didn't tell her everything. I didn't need to. I might need you to come with me somewhere, I said. She didn't ask where. When? Soon, I replied. I'll clear my schedule. The simplicity of that support steadied me more than any reassurance could have. Over the next few days, I reached out to people I hadn't spoken to in years. A former coworker who'd gone into legal administration, a neighbor whose daughter worked in estate planning. I didn't frame it as betrayal. I framed it as clarification. I need to understand my options, I said, quietly. They listened. They asked precise questions. They told me what to document and what not to touch yet. One of them, my old coworker, paused during our conversation. "Did you give verbal consent for these changes?" she asked. "No," I said. "Then don't let anyone tell you this is just a family matter." That sentence stayed with me. At home, I reorganized my desk. The leather notebook stayed open beside the laptop, now filled with neat annotations in the margins. I cross-referenced entries. I dated memories. I didn't embellish. I found emails from years back, archived under mundane subject lines. Quick update. FYI. I read them differently now, not for tone, but for timing, for what they coincided with. Each night, I backed everything up to an external drive and placed it in a drawer I rarely used. I didn't announce what I was doing. I didn't hint. The calls came anyway. My son left a voicemail. His voice was controlled, rehearsed. "You're escalating something that doesn't need to be escalated." I saved it, labeled it, didn't respond. My daughter-in-law texted, "We're concerned about your stress levels." I took a screenshot, filed it. Another message followed minutes later. "This isn't healthy." I didn't engage. The silence between us grew taut, like a wire pulled too tight. I felt it humming beneath daily tasks, folding laundry, answering emails, watering plants. I didn't let it distract me. One afternoon, I received a call from the bank manager again. "We've completed the review," he said. "There are inconsistencies." "I'd like that in writing," I replied. "You'll have it by end of day." When the email arrived, I printed it twice. The language was careful, but unmistakable. Consent could not be verified. Further action was recommended. I placed the pages into the binder, hands steady. That evening, my sister came over. We sat at the kitchen table, documents spread between us. She didn't interrupt. She didn't offer opinions until I finished. Finally, she looked up. "They underestimated you." I closed the binder. "They forgot who paid attention." She nodded. "What's your next step?" I thought of the upcoming family gathering, one I'd been invited to at the last minute, framed as a peace offering. A dinner, neutral ground, witnesses. "I'm going to listen," I said, "and I'm going to bring everything with me." My phone buzzed as if on cue. A group message notification. Plans confirmed. Time. Place. I looked at the screen, then at the binder, then at the brass nameplate resting on the edge of the desk, its surface worn but solid. I slid the binder into my bag and zipped it closed, already knowing that when I walked into that room, I wouldn't be coming empty-handed. The restaurant was louder than I expected. Not noisy exactly, just full of overlapping conversations, cutlery against plates, chairs scraping the floor in uneven rhythms. Warm light pooled over the long table they'd reserved, soft enough to look forgiving from a distance, harsh enough up close to flatten faces and leave nowhere to hide. I arrived early. I chose a seat halfway down the table, not at the head, not at the edge. Balanced. My bag rested at my feet, heavier than it should have been for a dinner. Inside, the binder pressed against my ankle like a reminder with a pulse. When my son walked in with his wife, the room shifted around them. People turned. Smiles spread. Congratulations floated through the air like confetti. She looked radiant, carefully styled, protected by attention. My son spotted me and hesitated, just a flicker, before nodding and guiding her toward their seats. He didn't hug me. He touched my shoulder briefly as he passed, fingers light, already retreating. Dinner unfolded in courses. Polite conversation, stories about work, complaints about traffic. Someone asked how the pregnancy was going, and my daughter-in-law answered graciously, hand on her belly, glowing under the lights. I ate slowly. I listened. Wine glasses emptied and refilled. The table loosened. People leaned in closer to hear one another. The noise softened into something intimate enough to carry weight. That was when she did it. I just want to say, my daughter-in-law said, tapping her glass lightly with her fork, smiling like this was spontaneous, how grateful we are for everyone who's respected our boundaries during this time. A few nods, murmurs of agreement. It hasn't been easy, she continued, but protecting our child comes first. Her eyes flicked toward me, not lingering, just enough. My son's jaw tightened. He didn't look at me. I felt the familiar urge rise, to minimize, to disappear, to make this smoother for everyone else. I let it pass. I reached down and lifted my bag onto my lap. I'm glad you brought that up, I said. The table stilled, not completely, just enough. My voice surprised even me. Calm, even, clear. My son turned toward me sharply. Mom. I opened the binder. I've been doing some organizing, I continued, flipping to the first tab. Paper slid softly against paper, a sound that carried farther than it should have. Since I was told to step back, I figured it was time I understood what I was stepping away from. My daughter-in-law's smile held, but something behind it tightened. Is now really the time? I think it is, I said. A silence opened, not empty, expectant. I slid one page free and placed it on the table between us, turning it so everyone could see. It was a bank statement, highlighted in neat lines. This shows a change in account authorization, I said, made without my written or verbal consent. My son's chair shifted. This is private. So were the changes, I replied. He reached for the paper. I held it still. I'm not accusing, I said. I'm clarifying. My daughter-in-law laughed softly, the sound brittle. This feels unnecessary. We explained we were simplifying things. I nodded. You did. But simplification requires agreement. Around us, forks paused. Someone coughed. A waiter slowed as he passed, sensing the shift. I turned another page. This is the metadata from the digital authorization. It shows the signature was applied from an IP address not associated with me. My son went pale. That doesn't mean anything, he said quickly. Those systems glitch. Sometimes, I agreed. That's why the bank conducted a review. Her hand tightened on her glass. Why would you do that? Because my name was removed from accounts I funded, I said. Because my retirement beneficiaries were altered. Because I was told it was for my own good while decisions were made in my absence. My voice didn't rise. I didn't need it to. My son pushed his chair back slightly. You're making a scene. No, I said. I'm finishing one. He stared at me, disbelief flickering across his face. Do you hear yourself? I met his eyes. Do you? The table felt smaller now. The warmth of the lights pressed down, exposing everything. My daughter-in-law leaned forward, her tone sharp with restraint. This is about stress. You don't handle change well. We were trying to protect you. A murmur of uncertainty rippled through the group. I slid the bank's compliance letter onto the table. They couldn't verify consent, I said. That's not about stress. That's about procedure. My sister, seated 2 chairs away, inhaled quietly. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. My son's mouth opened, then closed. He looked around as if searching for support that wasn't lining up fast enough. This is family, he said finally. You don't take family matters to institutions. You don't remove family from their own finances, I replied. The words landed hard, clean, unavoidable. A man across the table, someone from her side of the family, shifted uncomfortably. Maybe we should change the subject. My daughter-in-law shot him a look. No. She turned back to me, eyes bright. What do you want? I thought of the leather notebook, the brass nameplate, years of staying quiet so others could stay comfortable. I want transparency, I said, and my name restored where it belongs. That's ridiculous, she snapped. We're about to have a child. So am I said softly. I'm raising myself again. The room froze. My son laughed once, harsh and incredulous. You're being dramatic. I slid one final page forward, an email printout, his voicemail transcript attached beneath it. You told me I was escalating, I said, that I was making things adversarial. He stared at the paper. Recognition flickered. Panic followed. I saved everything, I continued, not to punish, to protect. The silence stretched. Cutlery lay untouched. The waiter retreated. My daughter-in-law's composure cracked. This is exactly why we needed boundaries, she said, voice shaking. You twist everything. I shook my head. I stopped twisting. I started reading. My son looked around the table, at faces no longer neutral, at questions forming behind polite restraint. You're embarrassing us, he said quietly. I leaned back in my chair. I was embarrassed in private. This is just light. The words seemed to drain the room of air. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then my sister finally did. I think she's been very clear. My daughter-in-law stood abruptly, chair scraping loudly. We're leaving. My son hesitated, eyes flicking between us, something raw and undone in his expression. You didn't have to do this, he said. I closed the binder. You didn't have to give me a reason. They walked out together, her hand gripping his arm too tightly. Conversations resumed slowly, uncertainly, like an engine restarting after a stall. I sat there, heart steady, hands resting on the binder. The waiter approached cautiously. Would you like dessert? I smiled, small but genuine. Yes, I said. I think I would. As the room settled back into itself, I realized something fundamental had shifted, not because I'd raised my voice, but because I hadn't. And I knew this dinner wasn't the end of the conflict, but it was the moment the truth stopped being contained. The quiet that followed lasted longer than I expected. Not dramatic quiet, not emptiness, just the kind that settles after something heavy has been put down and no one rushes to pick it back up. The next morning, sunlight crept through my kitchen window, soft and pale, landing on the table where the binder still sat. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. Its presence was enough, like a door that had finally been unlocked and left ajar on purpose. My phone stayed silent for hours. No apologies, no accusations, just space. I made breakfast slowly, listening to the small, ordinary sounds. The pan warming, bread toasting, the kettle clicking off. For weeks, I had felt watched even when alone. That feeling was gone. The house felt like mine again. By noon, an email arrived from the bank confirming the restoration of my access and a scheduled review to reverse the changes. Procedural language, clean conclusions. I forwarded it to my personal folder and closed the laptop without ceremony. In the afternoon, my sister stopped by with a bag of groceries I hadn't asked for. She didn't comment on the binder. She didn't ask how I felt. She unpacked apples into a bowl and set them gently on the counter like she was placing something precious. They called, she said finally. I nodded. I know. Your son sounded shaken. I considered that. So was I for a long time. She didn't argue. The message from him came 2 days later. Not a call, a text, shorter than I expected. I didn't realize how far it went. I need time to process. I read it once. I didn't answer right away. I didn't owe immediacy anymore. That evening, I took the brass nameplate down from the shelf and placed it back in the drawer. Not hidden, just stored. It didn't need to sit out as a warning now. It had done its work. When I finally replied, my message was simple. Take the time you need. So will I. There was relief in not chasing closure, in letting accountability exist without wrapping it in comfort. Weeks passed. The pregnancy continued. News reached me indirectly. Appointments, preparations, the careful reassembling of their world. I stayed where I was, available, but not leaning forward. At a family gathering later that month, my daughter-in-law and I exchanged polite words. Nothing sharp, nothing warm, just neutral ground. That was enough. Boundaries, I had learned, weren't walls. They were lines that let you stand without shrinking. My son approached me near the end of the evening. He looked older somehow, less certain. "I should have listened," he said quietly. I watched him for a moment, the familiar urge to smooth it over rising like muscle memory. I let it pass. "I'm listening now," I said. "That's different." He nodded, swallowing. "Can we start again?" I didn't answer with promises. I answered with truth. "We can start honestly." The leather notebook came out again, not to count losses, but to plan what came next. I wrote goals this time, small ones. Trips I'd postponed, classes I'd thought were too indulgent. I wrote my own name at the top of the page, steady and legible. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, I sat at the table and ran my fingers over the worn cover, feeling the grooves where years had pressed into it. For the first time, it didn't feel like a record of survival. It felt like a map. If my story stayed with you, maybe it's because you've held something similar in your hands. An object that once meant endurance and now means clarity. Sometimes we don't need to be louder to be heard. Sometimes we just need to stop stepping aside. If any part of this resonated with you, you can share it. I'm here, and I know how much it matters to finally stand in your own name.